que para los que no conocéis es profesor en la Universidad de Brasil y que va a proporcionarnos un seminario precisamente con el tema central tiene que ver con precisamente el 60 aniversario con el aniversario perdón, de la publicación de la teoría general de Keynes. Luego, posteriormente, en las próximas semanas tendremos otros dos seminarios, uno impartido sobre el tema de la política monetaria en México por el profesor Carlos Alberto Carrasco, y luego, posteriormente, también en abril, tendremos otros seminarios sobre las variedades de capitalismo y de los distintos modelos de crecimiento económico, los distintos growth models, que será impartido por el profesor Eckhard Hein del Berlin School of Economics and Law. Y luego, posteriormente, pues los nuevos seminarios los iremos anunciando a medida que se acerque la fecha de los siguientes. Entonces, bueno, sin más, como ya sé que la mayor parte de vosotros estáis trabajando o estáis ocupados, pues voy a dar la palabra al profesor José Luis Oreiro para que nos imparta el seminario. Se realizará una presentación en torno a hora y pico, por hora y media aproximadamente, y luego, pues en caso de que alguno de los asistentes quiera realizar cualquier tipo de comentario o de sugerencia, pues le daremos el paso para que podáis hablar. Lo que sí os rogaría es a todos los que tengáis en estos momentos conectado el micrófono, encendido el micrófono, por favor que lo apaguéis para evitar a veces solapamientos o ruidos de fondo. Entonces, sin más, cuando quieras, por cierto, se me ha olvidado también comentar a todas aquellas personas, a los miembros del programa de estudiantes del programa de doctorado o a aquellas personas que lo necesiten, lo que les enviaremos será el correspondiente certificado de asistencia al seminario, que ya sabéis que para los estudiantes de doctorado podéis incluirlo dentro de las diferentes actividades de carácter formativo realizadas durante la realización del doctorado. Entonces, sin más, cuando quieras, José Luis.
Bueno, buenos días. Good morning for everyone. Although I'm Brazilian and Spanish, and I speak Spanish fluently, I will present my webinar in English for those people that do not have Spanish as their mother language. So Jesus Ferreiro already told that this webinar is in celebration of the 90 years of the publication of the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money by John Maynard Keynes. And my presentation is based in a working paper that I published on the website of the Post-Keynesian Economic Society. And this working paper will be published as a chapter in a book celebrating the 90th anniversary of the General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. So let us begin sharing my window. Let me see here. No. Oh, where is it? Is this one? No.
No, no lo vemos.
What are you seeing on your screen?
You must click in share. We call it compartir. It's in a box with an arrow. That is.
Yes, but
the...
yeah. Let me see. Window.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, here it is.
So the title of the presentation is a macrodynamic model for a monetary production economy beyond short period equilibrium of Keynes' general theory. Well, I will start my presentation arguing why the general theory of employment, interest, and money is still relevant for today economics. In order to understand that, we must talk a little about the crisis of conventional macroeconomics. Well, the conventional or neoclassical macroeconomic theory has one of its main pillars, the idea that market economies present fluctuations in the level of production and employment around a long-term trend directed for employment of the factors of production.
Se ha congelado, yo al menos no te oigo, José Luis.
Sí.
Ah, ahora.
Okay. What's happened?
No, ahora está bien.
Ah,
Now it's okay.
vale. Bueno, continuando. So, in fact, the 3 decades that preceded the international financial crisis of 2008 created a great consensus in macroeconomics that fluctuations in the level of economic activity in advanced economies could be analyzed by a mechanism of impulse and propagation according to which the economic system is constantly hit by demand and or supply shocks, most of which are of a small magnitude with their own propagation mechanism. Assuming that such mechanisms are linear, then the level of economic activity will return to the potential of employment level that elapsed a certain time after the shock. This is the vision, for instance, in the Blanchard Summers book of 2019. Well, the financial crisis of 2008 can be seen as a scientific anomaly. Why? The eruption of the international financial crisis of 2008 was an anomaly that orthodox theory was simply unable to explicit or predict. The general bewilderment of the 2008 crisis was expressed by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II during a visit to London School of Economics on 4th October 2008. At the end of a short presentation on the origins and the consequences of the international financial crisis, Your Majesty, the Queen asks a single question. Why was no one able to predict this? On that occasion, the director of the research of the London School of Economics, that we can see on the photo with Your Majesty, the Queen, limited himself to respond that at all times, someone was trusting someone else and everyone thought they would be doing the right thing. Again, in December 2012, during a visit of the bank to the Bank of England's vault, where the country's gold reserve was kept, the Queen asked if the United Kingdom's financial authorities did not have the necessary instruments to deal with the 2008 crisis. Senior economists of the Bank of England Financial Services Committee told to Your Majesty the Queen that people thought that the markets are efficient. People thought regulation was not necessary. As the economy was stable, there was a growing complacency. Well, the crisis of 2008 had a long-lasting effect that was not predicted by the conventional theory. The financial crisis of 2008, instead of having its effects dissipated quickly as expected by conventional macroeconomic theory, was followed by a long period of contraction in the level of economic activity. As we can see in figure 1.1 in my right side of my slide, real GDP of the euro area measured in constant 2005 American dollars only returns to the pre-level of 2008 in 2014, as we can see in the blue line. But if we consider, however, what the GDP of the euro area countries would be if the 2008 financial crisis had not occurred and the euro area continued to grow at the same pace as the period of 2000 to 2007, then we will find that 2008 crisis produced a permanent loss of GDP in the countries of the euro area, approximately of 16% of GDP in 2022. To be more dramatic, if the financial crisis of 2008 did not occur, the euro area will be today the largest economy of the world. Not United States, not China. Okay, so the question is, and which is relevant for our discussion today, and the financial crisis of 2008 represents repeating the same mistakes of the Great Depression of 1929. It was not the first time, however, that this type of anomaly surprised economists. The Great Depression of 1929 have the same effect on the conventional theory prevailed in the 30s of last century, which rested on the Wicksellian connection of the quantitative theory of money. In the 1920s, the cyclical fluctuation in the level of economic activity and the level of prices were explained by divergences between saving and investment decisions, resulting from the mismatch of the interest rate with respect to its natural or normal value, determined by productivity of capital and the intertemporal preference of families. If the market rate of interest rose above the natural rate of interest, so the planned savings would be greater than investment, that is, the injections of demand into the circular flow of income would be smaller than the linkage of demand from this flow, generating a situation of excess aggregate supply, or general glut, which would result in a reduction in the price level. The rise of the market interest rate relative to the natural rate could be the result of both a reduction in the willingness of banks to lend money and a reduction in the willingness of entrepreneurs to borrow to finance new investment projects. The monetary contraction resulting from these events would result in a contraction of nominal income as predicted by the quantitative theory of money. Well, now, when an anomaly occurs in science, in general occurs what Thomas Kuhn called a paradigm shift. Well, the price adjustment that I was talking in the last slide, however, have no or negligible effect on the level of output and employment, which was taken for granted according to the quantitative theory of money. This is because variations in the price level should generate unexpected changes in profits, both in the consumer goods and the capital goods, which would force an adjustment of the market interest rate towards the natural rate of interest, thus ensuring the temporary nature of any macroeconomic imbalance. Well, the inconsistency between the predictions based on the Wicksellian variance of the quantitative theory of money and observed behavior of prices and the level of economic activity had already become clear to Keynes by the end of 1930. In the article, The Great Crisis of 1930, written at the end of December of that year, John Maynard Keynes explicitly recognized the possibility that the world recession of 1930 would turn into a depression, which actually ended up happening, whose effect would last for several years and would be catastrophic in terms of loss of material wealth and increased political instability. However, on a theoretical level, Keynes at that time was still an adherent of the quantitative theory of money, having published in the year of 1930 what should be his magnum opus, the treatise on money. So we have here two photos. On the left, John Maynard Keynes, on the right, Knut Wicksell, the great exponent of the quantitative theory of money in the beginning of the 20th century. And here we have the two books on this Wicksellian tradition. The first one, of course, is the Wicksell book, Interest and Prices, and a treatise on money of John Maynard Keynes, published in 1930, was the magnum opus of this Wicksellian tradition of the quantitative theory of money. Okay. Under the treatise on money, Keynes had reached an impasse, since in that book he proposes that monetary factors affect the volume of investment made in the economy, which should affect the long-term equilibrium configuration of the system due to its impact on the pace of capital. capital accumulation, but he still relied on the old framework of the quantitative theory of money, in which the currency should be neutral on the real variables of the economy, at least in the long run. The impasse is quite clear in the preface to the treatise, in which Keynes states that he was aware of the defects of the treatise, and that the ideas he had at the end of the book were quite different from the ideas he had when he started. Well, but what would be the origin of this intellectual discomfort? Keynes had realized that in theoretical tradition in which he had been educated and trained, money was not essential. This is because the theories accepted to that point were based on a Robinson Crusoe economy, in which an individual has to choose between hunting or fishing, subject to restrictions of effort that these activities provide, and being able to dedicate part of his time to the elaboration of instruments, which forces him to postpone their consumption. Here I would like to add the observation that the so-called DSG models, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, although they are very sophisticated mathematical terms, is essentially a representation of a Robinson Crusoe economy. Okay? Although it was recognized that the modern economy is immensely more complex than an economy of CR type, modern economies were not seen as essentially different from this stylization. CR economies are essentially non-monetary economies because there is no other individual with whom Robinson Crusoe can transact. Thus, currency cannot be seen as an essential factor in this type of economy. So here we have two pictures. On the right, we have the Robinson Crusoe Island, where Robinson Crusoe is taking the necessary efforts to make a living in isolation in the economy. And on the left side, we have what Minsky called the Wall Street paradigm or Wall Street economy, the New York stock exchange markets. The question of the really question that matters for us today is that for modern macroeconomics, the real representation of the economy is in sense the Robinson Crusoe type, not the New York stock and exchange economy. Okay? Well, in the economy of RC type, money can even be used as a neutral link between transactions with goods and services and transactions with real assets, but without being able to change the motives and decisions of economic agents, which can be described and analyzed perfectly in non-monetary terms. This type of economy was called by Keynes a real exchange economy. In this type of economy, money is not essential and for this reason neutral. In a pure exchange economy, the leaks in the circular flow of income are compensated by equivalent injections of demand through the operation of the interest rate mechanism. The non-essentiality of the money or currency ensures that the market interest rate fluctuates around the natural rate of interest in a such way as to make any divergences between injections and leaks temporary in nature. Well, in the summer of 1932, so just after 2 years of the on the pure theory of money given by Keynes on the spring of that year, Keynes decided to resume his lectures and change the title for the monetary theory of production, saying to many, "Why witness that the change of name mean a change in attitude?" In 1933, Keynes began to develop a new theoretical framework, which he called the monetary production economy. In this framework, money cannot simply be added to the structure of a real model, but must be essential to the model, which is to say that the fundamental theorems about the functioning of the economy should not be able to be expressed in terms of an economy in which money is absent. This new theoretical framework was presented and codified what would become the most important economic book of the 20th century, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, published by Keynes in February 1936, so just 90 years ago, and in the writings that followed it. In this way, Keynes developed through his general theory and his later writings a new worldview in the sense of Schumpeter, which consisted of a radical break with the conventional thinking prevailed until then. The worldview is defined by Schumpeter as the pre-analytical cognitive act that defines the set of phenomena that must be object of systematic analysis. So this guy is Joseph Schumpeter, and he defined the vision by this way: to be able to position ourselves in front of any problem, we must first have to visualize a distinct set of current phenomena as an object that deserves the attention of our analytical efforts. In other words, the analytic effort is necessarily preceded by a pre-analytic cognitive act that provides the raw material for the analytic effort. This pre-analytic cognitive act will be called vision. Well, and Keynes started to construct a new vision. In 1933, Keynes writes, "In my opinion, the main reason why the problems of crisis are not solved, or at least why this theory is so unsatisfactory, is to be found in the lack of what might be termed a monetary theory of production. What I would like to deal is with an economy in which money plays a part of its own and affects motives and decisions, and in short, one of the operational factors of the situation, so that the course of events cannot be predicted, either in the long period or in the short, without a knowledge of behavior of money between the first state and the last. And this is what we must mean when we speak of a monetary economy." So, the elaboration of a monetary theory of production requires the construction of a new theoretical framework in which money and production and investment decisions should be integrated into a model capable of determining the aggregate level of economic activity. It's important to stress that this model did not exist before the publication of the general theory. The Marshallian tradition in which Keynes has been educated was concerned only with markets, firms, and individuals in isolation from the rest of the economy. The theory of general equilibrium, pioneered by Valras, was not only the perfect illustration of a pure exchange economy in which where money is non-essential, nor did it lend itself to the analysis of determination of the level of production and employment of the economy as a whole, but only the determination of the vector of relative prices that should guarantee the simultaneous balance between supply and demand in all markets. The time had come for a scientific paradigm revolution in economics. So, what is a scientific revolution? For Thomas Kuhn, a scientific revolution is a non-cumulative rupture where a new paradigm, which is defined as a set of scientific beliefs and practice, completely replaces a previous paradigm which has entered into crisis due to anomalies, which means unsolvable problems that normal science has not been able to solve. This concept, central to his work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in 1962, describes scientific development as periods of normal science in which problems are solved within an accepted paradigm, and moments of crisis and revolution, which leads to change in the very way scientists see the world. Well, and Keynes believed that he was doing a scientific revolution. In a letter to Bernard Shaw, this gentleman on the left of John Maynard Keynes is the gentleman on the right, he writes, "To understand my state of mind, however, you have to know that I believe I'm writing a book on economic theory that will revolutionize widely, not, I suppose, all at once, but over the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economic problems. And of course, the title of the general theory resembles with the title of the Einstein work of 1916. The title was Relativity, the Special and General Theory, and Keynes' book was The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Keynes had known Einstein in a conference, I believe that in Germany or Switzerland in 1925. He met with Einstein, and of course that Keynes wants to do in economics what Einstein made in physics. This is a quote of Keynes about Einstein. To our generation, Einstein had been made to become a double symbol, a symbol of the mind traveling the cold regions of space, and a symbol of the brave and general outcast, pure in heart and cheerful of spirit. Well, so what is the anomaly that must be explained according to Keynes? Well, Keynes writes, is a striking feature of the economic system in which we live that, although it's subject to serious fluctuations in production and employment, is not violently unstable. Indeed, it seems capable of remaining in a chronic conditions of subnormal activity for a considerable period without, and that's important, without any market tendency towards recovery or complete collapse. Well, 90 years after the general theory was published, how succeed Keynes was in achieving his revolution in economic theory remains an unresolved question. For hardcore Keynesian economists like Pasinetti on his 2007 book, the revolution in economics was yet to be accomplished. For mainstream economists like Hicks, 1937, Pigou, 1943, Modigliani, 1944, and Patinkin, 1948, there was never any revolution in economic thought. Keynes' general theory just analyzed the implications of the imperfections in labor markets as wage rigidity, or of some extreme situation like the liquidity trap over the efficiency of self-regulating mechanisms of a market economy. The classical and the Keynesian models were combined in a more general model, the ESLM model, that was used as the main model for teaching economics in all over the world for more than 40 years after the publication of general theory. Much ink and paper has been used since the mid-70s to argue that Keynes made a theoretical revolution with his general theory. Davison in 1978 and Minsky in 1975 being the seminal works that started the literature on the economics of Keynes, or more broadly, post-Keynesian economics. After Fernando Carvalho 1992 book, Fernando Carvalho was my former PhD advisor, the principles of a monetary production economy had been well established and understood, and a lot of theoretical and empirical work had been done to translate Keynes' vision of a monetary economy in economic analysis. But up to now, little or no effort have been done to check if the model that Keynes presented in his general theory could deliver the results that was expected, namely the explanation of a chronic condition of subnormal activity for a considerable period without any market tendency towards recovery or complete collapse. So here we have the photos. The gentleman on the left is Paul Davison, in the middle Hyman Minsky, and in the right Fernando Carlos Carvalho, my former PhD supervisor. And there's the books, Paul Davison books. And the equilibrium level of employment is determined in the point where the expected proceeds of certain level of employment is equal to the supply price of this employment level. In a short period equilibrium, expected proceeds must be equal to realized proceeds, so there are no expectation disappointment. But the short period is a very short time span in chronological time, since it encompasses the period between the decision of entrepreneurs of hire workers and buy intermediate goods and the moment in which the finished goods are sold in the market. A revolution in economic thought clearly demands a model that is capable to analyze beyond any short period, to look at the dynamics of the economic through a succession of short periods to determine the long-run trend of output and employment. This clearly demands a model that takes in consideration the effects of investment decisions over the stock of capital and how the dynamic of stock of capital affects the inducement to invest. The bases for building such a model were presented in Keynesian theory, but are never assembled in a consistent dynamic macroeconomic model. So, the objective of my paper is this. Throughout this article, we will gather all these elements in a mathematical model capable of determining the dynamics over historical time of the level of income and employment, as well as the evolution of the capital stock and its impact on the marginal efficiency of capital and the incentive to investment in subsequent periods. In other words, the model presented here will go beyond the analysis of the condition for determining the short period equilibrium position and will seek to evaluate how the equilibrium values of a given short period affect the initial conditions of the subsequent short period and how this interferes with the equilibrium values of the next short period. Thus, instead of focusing our attention on analyzing the determination of the level of economic activity at the given point of time, we will analyze how this level of activity moves over sequence of short periods. So, what are our research questions? First one, the economy tends to converge to some long-term resting position, that is, the values of endogenous variables converge to a vector in which they are constant over time. If so, what is the nature of this position of equilibrium? We will assess whether the resting position to which the economy eventually converges in the long run is an equilibrium position with involuntary unemployment of the labor force. Second question, what are the possible self-feeding effects between endogenous variables and model parameters? We are interested in analyzing what are the possible effects between involuntary unemployment and the nominal wages, which we consider to be given at the beginning of each short period. An extensive literature developed in the period after the publication of general theory, according to which equilibrium with unemployment would be the result of the hypothesis of rigidity of nominal wages. This is precisely the case of Pigou 1943 article, Modigliani 1944 article, and Patinkin 1948 article. The curious fact about this literature is that it apparently ignores chapter 19 of the general theory, where Keynes, having once presented as a static model of determining the level of short-term employment in the previous chapter, analyzes the repercussions of unemployment on nominal wages. In chapter 19, Keynes rejects the idea that nominal wage flexibility can eliminate involuntary unemployment. On the contrary, Keynes concludes that wage flexibility can put the wage into a deflationary spiral that will increase rather than reduce involuntary unemployment. This issue is also being dealt within the subject. Okay, so let us begin with the structure of model equations. We will consider a closed economy without governmental activities that produces an homogeneous good, which can be used for both consumption and investment. We'll consider also population and workforce as constant. The capital stock is given in the short period, but will increase over time based on net investment made in each short period. Production technology is described by a Cobb-Douglas type of production function with constant returns to scale. Well, I have to take some considerations about this hypothesis because this assumption can be seen as problematic since the capital controversy in the 50s between the Cambridge in the United Kingdom and the Cambridge in Massachusetts in the United States is well known the impossibility of building an aggregate production function based on the principle of substitution between labor and capital and on decreasing marginal productivity of factors of production. On this article, however, we have decided to employ the same technological assumptions of the neoclassical models to arrive at the criticism that Keynesian results depends on the assumption of perfect complementarity between labor and capital, as Solow, in his 1956 article, used against the so-called Harrod-Domer model. As we will show in this article, the substitutivity between labor and capital allowed by a neoclassical production function reinforces rather than weaken the equilibrium with unemployment in a sequence of short period equilibrium. So here we have the production function is a standard Cobb-Douglas production function with constant return to scale. We think that, well, the variables are well known. Epsilon is the real output, K is capital, the stock of capital, and N is the level of employment. As discussed in my 2025 book in chapter 2, the market structure is perfect competition. So the first principle of the classical theory applies, which means the real wage is equal to the marginal productivity of labor. Under these conditions, the coefficient of the factor of production labor in a Cobb-Douglas production function will be equal to the share of wages in national income, while the coefficient of capital will be equal to the share of profits. In this context, income distribution is exogenous to the process of determining the level of income employment being determined by factors related to technology. Well, the point of effective demand, if entrepreneurs formulate correct expectations about the point of effective demand, then the short period equilibrium level of income will be determined by equation 2, where the left-hand side of equation 2, we have the short period equilibrium level of real income, and on the right side of equation 2, we have a ratio between investment, realized investment on numerator, and in the denominator, we have the propensity to consume out of wages, CW, and the share of wages in income. Okay. Well, we have to make an important distinction between investment decisions and investment realized investment. According to Asimakopoulos on his 1991 book, it's necessary to distinguish between planned and realized investment. Following my 2025 book on chapter 3, we will suppose that investment made in the current short period corresponds to a weighted average between the planned investment and the two previous short periods, which is given by equation 3. Due to the reversibility of time, decisions made in previous period are a given from the point of view of current period. Thus, the investment made in the current short period is taken as given, determined by decisions that were made in the two past periods. So we have the short period model. Equation 2 is the equilibrium level of income as determined by the principle of effective demand. Equation 4 is the demand for labor according to the Cobb-Douglas production function. Equation 5a is the definition of real wage. VT is the real wage in period T, which is equal to the ratio of nominal wage, W bar. W bar means the nominal wage there was settled on the niche on the beginning of the short period by the wage bargaining between unions and firms, and PT is the price level in period T. And equation 5b is the first postulate of the classical theory, according to which the real wage is equal to the marginal productivity of labor. Okay, so this model is a block recursive model. The system formed by equations 2, 4, 5a, 5b. We have 4 linear independent equations and 4 unknowns. An important characteristic of this model is that it's block recursive. There is the interdependence between the equations of the model is not general, allowing the systems of equation to be solved in a sequential manner. In effect, the equilibrium level of output is determined by equation 2. Once the equilibrium level of output has been determined, the short period equilibrium employment level will be determined by substituting equation 2 in equation 4, taking the short period capital stock as given. Once the equilibrium employment level has been determined by means of the equation resulting from the substitution of 2 and 4, the short-term equilibrium real wage can be determined by substituting the resulting wage in equation 5b. Finally, given the short period equilibrium real wage level by the equation resulting from the last substitution, one can determine the short period equilibrium price level by substituting this resultant into equation 5a. Well, P9 n bar, the number of workers available in the short period. Except by a happy coincidence, there is no mechanism that guarantees that the level of short-term equilibrium employment will be equal to the number of available workers. In general, we'll have n star t lower than n bar, that is, we will have involuntary unemployment of the workforce. Note that the only variable that can be affected by a change in the money wage rate at short period equilibrium is the general price level. The lower the wage money rate is, the lower will be the general level of prices. In other words, the short-term equilibrium with involuntary unemployment of labor force does not depend on the value of the monetary wage rates, and there's therefore any hypothesis of the degree of rigidity of nominal wages. This is the result that Keynes obtained in his general theory. Okay. This is, however, not enough to explain the persistence of unemployment, involuntary unemployment over a sequence of short periods. Contrary to what is preached by macroeconomics textbooks, Keynes was not interested in explaining the determination of the level of employment at a given point in time, but because capitalist economies had fluctuations in economic activity around a level that is chronically insufficient to provide full employment of the labor force. In this context, short-term equilibrium is not enough. We must analyze how the economy moves between short period equilibrium positions and whether this movement generates some kind of long-term norm of trend understood as a resting position of the system, which is devoid of endogenous dynamics. If this norm is such that once the endogenous dynamics are exhausted, the level of economic activity is insufficient to provide full employment of the labor force, then involuntary unemployment will be persistent, and the paradigm of the monetary economy of production will have been successful in terms of changing the way the world thinks about economic problems. So, to do so, it will be necessary initially to take into account the effects of investment decisions on the capital stock and thus on the scarcity of capital, which is the origin of the flow of quasi-rents expected from capital equipment throughout its useful life, and therefore one of the determining factors of the marginal efficiency of capital. The investment made in the current short period is the result of investment decisions made in previous periods when the capital stock was lower than the capital stock in the present. The implementation of these investment decisions will increase the capital stock in subsequent periods, impacting the marginal efficiency of capital and thus the planned investment in the future. The relationship between stocks and flows creates a dynamic intrinsic to the model. That is a dynamic that results from the interaction between these variables instead of being posed on an ad hoc basis. No need for random shocks. Remember, as Einstein says, God does not play dice. This is the fundamental characteristic of macroeconomic models, with consistency between stocks and flows, developed from the pioneering work of Godwin and Lavoie on their 2007 book. The approach of this article follows in part this methodology of construction of macroeconomic models. So here I have the equations. I will talk very brief about that. Equation 6 is the equation of the dynamics of capital stock. Delta is the depreciation rate of capital stock. Equation 7 is the equation of planned investment. The planned investment period T depends on theta 0, which is autonomous investment, dt, which is the marginal efficiency of capital in short period, and ILP, which is the long-term interest rate. In accordance with the nature of the expected quasi-rents from which entrepreneurs calculated marginal efficiency of capital of their investments, you will assume that the marginal efficiency of capital is given by equation 8, where it depends, the marginal efficiency of capital, on the output capital ratio, VT minus 1, okay, which will be considered as an index of scarcity of capital. The lower this index, the less scarce the capital will be in comparison with the size of the market, and therefore the greater will be the expected flow of quasi-incomes. And the long-term interest rate is determined by what Keynes called in chapter 15 of his general theory on the safe rate of interest. What is the safe rate of interest? Is the rate of interest that the market expects to hold in the long term. Is a social convention. Is not determined by the marginal productivity of capital, is not determined by the preferences of households, is a social convention in the financial markets. And on delta LP, which is the liquidity premium of long-term securities relative to short-term securities. Okay, so here we have the full model, okay, full dynamic model. So we have to solve the model. We saw in section 3 that the short period equilibrium values are determined by the subsystem formed by equations 2, 4, 5a, and 5b. These values, however, depend on a series of predetermined variables, such as the capital stock inherited from the previous periods and investment decisions made in other periods, which depend on the past short period equilibrium values. We thus have a system whose present depends on the past and which the future will be shaped in the present. In short, we have an economy that moves through historical time. The solution of this system of equations involves the use of recursive methods. We need to define the values of the initial conditions of the system and the values of the parameters, then calculate the short period equilibrium values one by one over a sequence of periods. To facilitate this process, it is convenient to calculate the steady state of the system, that is, the values of endogenous variables in a context where the system is devoid of endogenous dynamics in a such way that endogenous variables are constant over time. So here we have the steady state values of our system. The system is formed by 9 linearly independent equations and 9 endogenous variables. So the system is a determinate system, which means that the system has a solution. Well, then we calculate the steady state values of the system. Okay. Equation 14, the steady state value of the marginal, or the index of capital scarcity. The equation 15 is the steady state value of marginal efficiency of capital. Equation 16, the steady state value of investment. equation 17, the state value of capital stock, and equation 18, the steady state level of the real output, according to the principle of effective demand. Well, I think that I have already of output will not be equivalent to the level of output compatible with the full employment of the labor force. In addition, the reader should note that the steady state level of production depends exclusively on the demand conditions of the economy. The supply side does not interfere in determining the level of utilization of existing resources. The validity of the principle of effective demand is not therefore restricted for a short period. Finally, the public's preference for liquidity directly interferes in determining the level of economic activity. A greater perception of uncertainty on the part of decision makers will be reflected in a higher liquidity premium for long-term bonds or on a higher level of the safe interest rate, thus reducing investment and the level of production in the steady state. Well, here we have a new set, the part 2 of the steady state values. I will skip that. Well, in order to make the numerical simulation of the model, I use these parameter values, which is in the table. For instance, alpha, we are taking a 0.5. The marginal propensity, the propensity to consume out of wages is equal to 1, and other variables are on the table. Here on table 2, there are the steady state values of endogenous variables. I calculated this using the Excel software, so it's very simple to deal with the model mathematically because it's a recursive model. Well, interpretation. 2 things draw attention in table 2 are the steady state values in the output capital ratio and unemployment rate. The first, because it is extremely low. The second, because it is very high. About the steady state value of the output capital relationship, equation 14 shows that it is equal to the product between the depreciation rate of the capital stock and the investment multiplier. In the numerical simulation, we are assuming a value of 10% per period for depreciation rate, which is far from being a low value, and the investment multiplier is equal to 2 for the values considered of the propensity to consume from wages and the share of wages in income. A multiplier, an investment multiplier between 1.7 and 2.3 is consistent with the existing empirical literature on the subject. In this context, the low value of the output capital ratio must be the result of the absence of autonomous component of demand other than investment. More specifically, in the model presented here, there is no autonomous component of demand that does not create productive capacity, like, for instance, exports of government expenditure. So any one of you that wants to extend the model can simply add a government activities in the model or open the economy. And I can assure to you that with this addition, the value of the output capital ratio will be a little higher. The addition of autonomous consumption should also have the effect of stabilizing the steady state output capital ratio at a higher level. The second question is, why a so high equilibrium unemployment? Remember, in the steady state solution, the unemployment rate was 60%, or more precisely 59.4%. And this number appears to be unrealistically high. In fact, even if we consider discouraged or underutilized workers as part of the official unemployment statistics, a level above 30% does not seem to be consistent with the experience of developed or developing countries, except, of course, in periods of severe economic crisis. This extremely high value for the unemployment rate is, in fact, the result of the hypothesis we are adopting about technology and the composition of autonomous demand. When describing the production technology, we decided to use a Cobb-Douglas type production function with constant returns to scale. This option was due to a deliberate strategy of minimizing divergences with respect to traditional theory to highlight the generality of the results presented here. A Cobb-Douglas production function assumes that capital and labor are substitutes for each other, which means the same amount of output can be produced from different combinations of capital and labor. This hypothesis is unacceptable to most, if not all, of the world's orthodoxy. But the theoretical issue to be emphasized is that persistent involuntary unemployment does not require technical complementarity between the factors of production. Thus, according to Okan's principle of simplicity, we must use the simplest hypothesis, in this case the most accepted, about technology. There is technology in which the factors of production can be substitutable for each other. So we have the simulation, numerical simulation of the model. In the figure 1, we have the evolution of capital stock and the output level. In figure 2, we have the dynamics of index of capital scarcity and marginal efficiency of capital. Figure 3, the evolution of employment on the left and unemployment rate on the right. Here, in figure 4, we have the evolution of real wage. And here, in figure 5, we have the evolution of the general level of prices. And here, in figure 6, we have the relation between the level of employment and the real wage. It's important to stress that this relation cannot be seen as a demand labor, as a curve of demand for labor, as in standard textbooks. The relation between employment and real wage is inverse or negative simply because when firms hire more labor due to decreasing marginal productivity of labor, real wages have to be reduced. Okay. Well, now the last part of the paper, we shall now examine the case in which the money wage rate is not constant over the sequence of short periods, but may be very depending on the evolution of the general price level and the state of the labor market. We are interested in analyzing whether a reduction in money wage rate can stimulate the level of economic activity as it is presented in traditional macroeconomics textbook, Blanchard, for example. In these textbooks, the student is presented with an aggregate demand curve that is defined as the locus of the combinations between the general price level and the level of production for which the market for goods is in equilibrium. That is, companies are able to sell all their production so that involuntary variation of inventories is equal to 0. In the short run, the general price level is seen as an exogenous variable because it reflects the rigidity of the nominal wage rate. Generally, in more modern textbooks, such as Blanchard, the general price level is determined based on a markup on the unit cost of production, which is equal to the ratio between the monetary wage rate and labor productivity. Thus, the market structure assumed in most modern macroeconomic manuals is imperfect competition, which allows firms to have pricing power. This, however, is not the market structure that Keynes assumed in his general theory. Keynes considered an economy operating under conditions of perfect competition, where the general level of prices was adjusted in such a way as to equalize the real wage of workers with the marginal productivity of labor calculated at the point of effective demand. So, in this context, a reduction in the price level can only occur because of a fall in the money wage rate, which may be the result of involuntary unemployment reduce firms' unit cost of production, allowing them to be able to reduce the prices of their products without reducing their markup margins. A process of deflation of wages and prices begins. So, how can wage and price deflation stimulate economic activity? According to Modigliani, 1944 paper, he defined two mechanisms. The first, which we can call the Keynes effect, considers that the fall in the general price level will produce a reduction in the transactional demand for money, which, assuming the supply of money to be constant, will reduce the interest rate, stimulate investment and the level of production through the multiplier. The problem with this effect is that for its operation, it is necessary that the economy is not operating in a situation of a liquidity trap, as Modigliani supposes to be the case considered by Keynes in his general theory. Thus, for a deflation of prices and wages to stimulate the economy, the operation of another mechanism is necessary. So Modigliani presents a second one. The second, which we can call the Pigou effect or real liquidity effect, presupposes the existence of an autonomous component in consumption demand, and that this autonomous consumption depends on the stock of wealth of households. Money is a part of the stock of wealth of households, but only that part that consists of paper money in the possession of the public. Bank deposits are an asset for households, but a liability for banks, and therefore for households that own banking institutions. Since the assets of one household are the liabilities of another, then the net effect on the wealth of households will be zero. In the aggregate of the volume of means of payment equal to the sum between paper money held by public and demand deposits, paper money held by the public constitutes a very small fraction, which tends to decrease over time due to the development of new payment technology, such as debit cards, internet banking, or Brazilian banks. So, the share of paper money had by the public in the stock of wealth of families is very low, not to say irrelevant. This small detail was disregarded by Modigliani, who assumed that price deflation will result in an increase in the value of households' wealth and therefore in their propensity to consume. If the price deflation is large enough, then the corresponding increase in public consumption will put the economy in a position of equilibrium with full employment. It follows that, according to Modigliani, the rigidity of the monetary wage is a necessary and sufficient condition for equilibrium with unemployment. Well, both mechanisms pointed out by Modigliani depends on a crucial hypothesis, that is, the quantity of money is constant or exogenous. Although Keynes assumed in his general theory a vertical money supply, but not in his treatise Money, the practice of central banks is to set the policy interest rate, that is, the interest rate of the interbank market, making the monetary base an endogenous variable. In this case, the deflation of wages and prices will result in a contraction of both the monetary base and the volume of means of payment, leaving short and long-term interest rates unchanged. Moreover, even if paper money held by public can be considered, at least in short run, a constant, the effect of price deflation on households' propensity to consume would be negligible. As an example, let us consider the propensity of families to consume from wealth is equal to 5%, and that paper money represents 10% of the stock of wealth of families. Well, a 10% deflation in 1 year, which is a very large deflation, would result in an increase of only 1% in household wealth in real terms and only 0.05% increase in planned consumer spending. So it would take a 10% a year of deflation for decades for there to be any discernible effect on consumer spending and employment. By then, as Keynes should say, we will all be dead. So we will make wage flexible in the model, as according to equation 21. Some clarification is needed about this equation. In the first place, workers do not suffer from monetary illusion because the nominal wage desired by workers depends on the perceived purchasing power of wages and therefore on the general price level. Secondly, the state of labor market is represented by change in unemployment rate in the 2 periods prior to the current period. If the unemployment rate is rising, then this should lead workers to accept in their dealing with firms a lower than desired money wage. The opposite occurs if the unemployment rate is increasing over time. The reader should realize that in equation 21, there is no natural value for the unemployment rate. There is a value such that the monetary wage will be equal to the desired by the workers. Any unemployment rate, if it's kept constant over time, is compatible with a monetary wage equal to the desired one. Finally, the level of wage flexibility is given by coefficient in the equation 21, beta 1. Okay? The higher the value of this coefficient, the more flexible that is, the more sensitive the variations in unemployment rate will be the monetary wage rates. Well, how can wage flexibility affect output and employment? In order to do that, it has to affect the investment rates. So I will skip this, but mainly what we done in the model is to remember that the nominal interest rate is equal to real interest rate and price changes. So this is done in equation 25. We set the parameters of the equations in beta 0 equal to 0.4 and beta 1 equal to 1. And then we have the dynamic of general level of prices and nominal wage rates. As we can see, once we make wages flexible in the model, we have both a price deflation and a wage deflation. And when we compared the system without flexible wages and with flexible wages, we see that the level of flexibility of wages have almost zero effect over investment in the long term. Well, my final remarks. In this article, we present a dynamic model for determining the level of output, employment, capital stock, real wage, investment, marginal capital efficiency, and the capital output relationship or capacity utilization. Initially, we found the short period solution of the model in which the capital stock is kept constant. In the short period equilibrium, the endogenous variables are the level of production, the level of employment, the real wage, and the general price level. In the short period equilibrium, there is no mechanism that can ensure that all workers who wish to work at market wages will be able to find employment. That is, short period equilibrium will be characterized by the existence of involuntary unemployment of the labor force. Subsequently, the model was extended to consider the effects of investment made in each short period on the capital stock of the subsequent period and therefore on the initial conditions of the subsequent short period. In other words, we incorporated into the model a relationship between flows and stocks that was absent from the theoretical framework presented by Keynes. Once this relationship was incorporated, it was also possible to analyze the impact of capital accumulation on the marginal efficiency of capital and therefore on the incentive to invest. In this extended model, the flows determined the change in inventories, and the change in inventories influenced the flows in subsequent periods. An intrinsic dynamic is thus created in the model, eliminating the existence of black holes. Once we have presented the structure of the standard model, we calculated its steady-state solution. The most important result is that even taking into account the interrelationship between investment and capital stock, that is, leaving aside the Marshallian short term, the economy tends to operate with involuntary unemployment of the labor force in the long run. That is, once the internal adjustments of the model are exhausted, it is devoid of endogenous dynamics. The extremely high value of the steady state level of unemployment rate explained, on one hand, by the hypothesis adopted regarding technology, which allows a substitution between capital and labor. In this context, the accumulation of capital by increasing the productivity of labor generates a reduction in the number of workers needed to produce the quantity of goods that firms can sell in the market, given the effective demand for their products. On the other hand, the absence of an autonomous component of demand that does not create capacity, such as autonomous consumption or exports, causes effective demands to be relatively low with respect to the steady-state capital stock, thus reducing job creation per unit of capital. Finally, a new extension of the model was presented in which monetary wages are not constant, but react to prevailing conditions in the labor market, being flexible. It has been shown that wage flexibility is incapable of creating a convergence to an equilibrium position with full employment because of negligible effects such flexibility has on firms' planned investment. In short, equilibrium with unemployment is an emerging property of any capitalist economy that is based on the principles of laissez-faire, and this is thus not a result restricted to the short run, Marshallian short run, or dependent on the assumption of price and wage rigidity. So that's what I have to present. This is my contact, and I'd be happy to, where am I? To answer questions of the public.
Muchísimas gracias, José Luis. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation. So, as you have said, there is time for the floor for the people to make their comments, suggestions or questions. So, ahora es como acabo de decir, es el momento para que las personas que han asistido a la presentación de este seminario tan interesante puedan realizarle los comentarios o las sugerencias o preguntas que estimen oportunos. No sé si alguien quiere romper el hielo y empezar ya con la primera de las preguntas o cuestiones o comentarios.
Ahí me vas a permitir un momento, José, que me tengo que salir, porque tengo que ir
Sí.
ahora al médico, a ver si me da antibiótico. José Luis, me ha gustado mucho el seminario, lamento no poderme quedar a tu debate y espero verte en fechas próximas. Gracias a todos, ¿de acuerdo?
Vale,
Muchísimas gracias.
Venga, hasta luego. Adiós.
Hasta luego.
Bueno, a mí, si me permitís, sí que me gustaría hacer un comentario en cuanto a lo que es el contenido y es también una pregunta a José Luis. Y es que hay un aspecto que me ha resultado, vamos, por así decirlo, un poco llamativo, y es que a diferencia de buena parte de los desarrollos post-keynesianos, sobre todo a partir de los planteamientos desarrollados por Paul Davidson, lo que echo de menos, o me gustaría que explicaras precisamente por qué ha adoptado esa decisión, en el cual no hay un reconocimiento explícito o una inclusión, o están incluidos dentro de la variable de los modelos, valores de las variables relacionadas con las expectativas. Porque sí que es cierto que buena parte de todos los desarrollos de la economía mainstream moderna, de la neoeconomía no clásica y de la economía no keynesiana, están precisamente basados en el hecho de que están presuponiendo que la existencia de un equilibrio se debe fundamentalmente a dos factores, a la combinación de dos factores. Uno que es la perfecta flexibilidad de precios y salarios, como tú bien has destacado, pero otro también es la existencia de información perfecta, de individuos dotados de expectativas racionales. Individuos que tienen la capacidad para incorporar de forma correcta el futuro en sus procesos de toma de decisiones, que es una forma de decir civilinamente o sutilmente que el tiempo no existe. Porque evidentemente, una vez que tenemos todo el conocimiento perfecto de lo cual es el pasado y el presente y el futuro, no hay necesidad de incluir el tiempo como tal, porque no tienen un efecto sobre las decisiones. Claro, eso de los trabajos de Davidson y otros economistas precisamente lo que están valorando es que esa crítica a la existencia de ese equilibrio se debe precisamente al papel que juega el hecho de que, a diferencia de los planteamientos ortodoxos, los individuos no están dotados de información perfecta ni de capacidad de procesamiento perfecta, no tienen expectativas racionales, sino que se mueven en un entorno de incertidumbre, en un entorno donde los individuos, es cierto que incorporan el futuro en sus decisiones, pero sin que esté garantizada o sin que esté garantizado la ausencia de errores de predicción y de problemas a la hora de poder tomar la decisión correcta, lo que puede afectar a sus decisiones, como por ejemplo en las decisiones de inversión o de determinados gastos o determinadas operaciones financieras o determinadas operaciones de consumo de bienes duraderos en los cuales muchas veces lo que puede ocurrir, y ahora es algo que lo podemos estar visualizando claramente con lo que está ocurriendo en el Oriente Medio, es que allí en aquellas circunstancias donde de repente aumenta o ha pasado también incluso con la crisis financiera del COVID, en aquellas circunstancias en las cuales de repente el futuro deja de ser predecible y empieza a expandirse la incertidumbre, simplemente los agentes toman la decisión es la de no realizar esas operaciones, por ejemplo, de consumo o de inversión. Entonces, un poco sí que me gustaría el que desarrollaras precisamente cuáles son las razones que te han conducido a no incorporar de forma tan detallada el papel de las expectativas.
Bueno, Jesús, mira, es que las expectativas están eh, inseridas en el modelo de la
Ujú,
manera como Keynes ha supuesto en el capítulo 2 de la teoría general. O sea, en un contexto de incertidumbre, el individuo, aunque pese la incertidumbre, tiene que tomar decisiones, ¿no?
ujú,
Entonces, ¿cómo un individuo que tiene que tomar decisión en un contexto de incertidumbre toma la decisión? Toma la decisión adheriendo a la convención de que el futuro va a ser parecido con el presente. O
ujú,
sea, es un comportamiento convencional, lo que
ujú,
significa que básicamente en términos de la función de inversión, lo que cada empresario está suponiendo es que eh, la rentabilidad actual de las inversiones va a se mantener en el futuro. Claro,
ujú,
esto es una convención que está hecha en una base muy frágil. O sea,
ujú,
se puede cambiar a cualquier momento. Eso está incorporado en la parte autónoma de la función de inversión, el teta cero, ¿no? Que puede representar, por ejemplo, un cambio en el estado de confianza. O sea, cuando
ujú,
cambia el estado de confianza, tienes un cambio en la inversión autónoma, ¿no? Que entonces sería como un choque exógeno en el modelo, ¿no? Pero les está incorporado. Además, en el coste de capital, acuérdate que la tasa de interés de largo plazo depende tanto de la tasa de la safe rate of interest, la tasa
entonces, ujú,
segura de interés, que es una convención social,
sí,
¿no? Y también en el premio de liquidez. Y eso puede ser una cosa muy importante para un contexto de conflicto internacional que tenemos ahora, ¿no? En que se incrementa la incertidumbre. Lo que va a pasar es que el premio de liquidez se va a incrementar y con eso la tasa de interés de largo plazo. O sea, los cambios en la percepción, que eso es importante, ¿no?
ujú,
La incertidumbre no es mensurable. Lo que
vale,
puede cambiar es la percepción de
opción,
los agentes económicos de la incertidumbre, ¿no? Hay momentos en que la percepción es baja, ¿no? Y entonces significa que, por ejemplo, el premio de liquidez va a ser bajo, con eso la tasa de interés de largo plazo va a ser baja y también que el componente autónomo de la inversión va a ser alto, ¿no? Y por tanto vamos a tener, por todo más constante, una inversión más alta. Pero el modelo sí se está captando la manera que Keynes suponía considerar el efecto de la incertidumbre sobre la decisión de inversión, que es sobre el espíritu animal de los
ujú,
empresarios, ¿no? y sobre la preferencia para liquidez. Pero digo, cuando la cuestión que Keynes plantea en el capítulo 12 es que los empresarios tienen que tomar decisiones, ¿no? Es como yo siempre en mis clases doy este ejemplo para que la gente consiga entender lo que es el animal spirits. Y un ejemplo muy sencillo, que es el día D del desembarco en Europa, en Normandía, ¿no? Pues en el día 6 de junio, de 1944, pues los informes meteorológicos estaban diciendo que iba a tener mal tiempo en el Canal de la Mancha, ¿no? Y también había una especulación de que el local preciso del desembarco ya era conocido por los alemanes. O sea, que había una posibilidad de que cuando las tropas aliadas llegasen a las playas de Normandía, los esperasen todas las divisiones panzer del ejército alemán en el occidente, ¿no? Pero el general Eisenhower tuvo que tomar una decisión, ¿no? Él ha simplemente dicho, ok, let's go, ok, nos vamos. Y bueno, se pasó la invasión a Normandía, que fue un suceso, pero ojo, que Eisenhower tenía dos cartas escritas. Una para el caso que es el que lo ocurrió, que es de suceso del desembarco de Normandía, pero tenía una otra escrita en caso de desastre y que reconocía que tenía toda la responsabilidad y pedía pues dimisión del cargo de comandante en jefe de los ejércitos aliados. Entonces, bueno, creo que esto contesta tu pregunta, Jesús.
Muchas gracias, José Luis. ¿Alguna otra pregunta, cuestión que queréis plantear? Sí,
Daniel.
Daniel.
Aprovecho aquí. Gracias, José Luis, por la charla. Muy interesante. Voy a intentar resumir un poco para que no se nos vaya un montón del tiempo. Me gustaría que desarrollaras un poco más, porque me quedé un poco con la duda, porque lo comentaste, de introducir en el modelo una ecuación de producción neoclásica, tradicionalmente.
Sí.
Porque claro, uno que está leyendo últimamente más modelos post-keynesianos, justamente la típica es la de Leontief. Entonces, no sé si podrías desarrollar un poquito más
Bueno,
la justificación y la motivación, porque no me quedó claro si era capaz por una técnica de publicar, que sería totalmente legítimo, ¿no? En el sentido, oye, yo quiero publicar una revista y que es totalmente legítimo, que yo lo haría también, o es por capaz justamente por este concepto de eficiencia del capital, que por tanto necesitas necesariamente ese tipo de función de producción o otra razón, y entonces me lo puedes explicar un poco más. Y la otra duda que te quería comentar es, una de las últimas conclusiones es que los salarios únicamente una bajada de salarios pueden de alguna manera mejorar la actividad económica a través de la inversión. No sé si estamos, no de la misma manera, pero de alguna manera linkeándolo a la literatura post-kalekiana de modelos wage-led, profit-led de alguna manera, aunque sea indirectamente, o si se podría relacionar el modelo por ahí, aunque no sea totalmente esa idea. Entonces, si me puedes desarrollar esas cosillas, muchas gracias.
nada, me ha encantado con tus preguntas, que son muy, muy relevantes. Bueno, el uso de la función de producción Cobb-Douglas, bueno, fue un poco, es una razón de retórica, y fue lo mismo de Keynes. Mira, cuando Keynes ha escrito la teoría general en 1936, fíjate que ya existía la teoría de la competencia imperfecta, incluso desarrollada por John Robbins, 1926, ¿no? Pero Keynes no trabaja con competencia imperfecta, trabaja con competencia perfecta. Puede ser no, porque Keynes era marshalliano, sí, fue alumno de Marshall, pero hay una razón retórica. Es que Keynes quería mostrar que el paro involuntario no era resultado de imperfecciones en el mercado de trabajo o en el mercado de bienes, ¿no? Quería mostrar que era algo más esencial a la operación de una economía monetaria, ¿ok? Entonces, que podía hacer la hipótesis de competencia perfecta y mostrar que mismo en el terreno de, entre comillas, el adversario, conseguía generar sus resultados. Y es por eso que el libro de Keynes se llama la teoría general, no la teoría específica. ¿Vale? Entonces, cuando yo estoy usando una función producción Cobb-Douglas, lo que estoy haciendo, en el punto de vista retórico, es minimizar las diferencias con respecto al mainstream. Mira, yo no necesito de ninguna hipótesis de complementariedad de capital de trabajo para mostrar el paro involuntario, ¿no? Porque esto es importante, porque se basa en la literatura de crecimiento económico de los años 50, el que empieza con el artículo de Solow, pues él va a criticar al modelo Raro-Dahmer. Y va a decir, mira, el resultado del modelo Raro-Dahmer se debe exclusivamente al hecho de que la tecnología es una tecnología con complementariedad entre capital y trabajo. Pero si asumimos una especificación más estándar de tecnología, como los neoclásicos, economistas neoclásicos siempre hicieron, bueno, el resultado Raro-Dahmer se anula, no pasa más, ¿entiendes? Entonces, yo quería exactamente demostrar esto, que se puede, con los supuestos tradicionales de tecnología Cobb-Douglas y competencia perfecta, porque el modelo no está asumiendo absolutamente nada en términos de competencia imperfecta, sea en el mercado de bienes o mismo en el mercado de trabajo. Mira, la ecuación de sueldo monetario puede ser resultado de una negociación colectiva entre el sindicato y las empresas, o puede ser simplemente el resultado de un mercado de trabajo que es atomizado, ¿no? Entonces, no hay ninguna hipótesis, no estoy haciendo ninguna hipótesis institucional sobre el funcionamiento del mercado de trabajo. O sea, el modelo es compatible con un mercado de trabajo americano e inglés, donde no tienes muchos sindicatos, o con un mercado de trabajo como el sueco, ¿no? Donde tienes un sindicato centralizado, ¿no? Entonces, esta es la idea básica, ¿vale? Y te lo digo, el resultado del modelo en términos de paro, que da una tasa de paro de casi 60% de la fuerza de trabajo, es justamente por la hipótesis neoclásica. ¿Por qué? Porque como trabajo y capital son sustitutos en la función de producción, en la medida que las empresas van acumulando capital, lo que va aconteciendo es que la productividad marginal del trabajo se incrementa, y como incrementa la productividad marginal del trabajo, entonces para producir y vender la misma cantidad de bienes necesitas de una cantidad cada vez menor de trabajadores. ¿Y cómo esto puede ser arreglado? Bueno, dentro del modelo de dos maneras. La primera sería sustituir la función de producción neoclásica por una función de producción Cobb-Douglas o John-Tief. En este caso, cuando el stock de capital se incrementa al mismo tiempo la cantidad de trabajo necesaria, ¿no?, para producir la misma cantidad de producto. La otra sería, pues, introduciendo algún tipo de gasto autónomo que no crea capacidad productiva. Por ejemplo, las exportaciones. Entonces, porque el problema del modelo es que las empresas van acumulando capital, esto va incrementando la productividad del trabajo y por lo tanto las empresas necesitan de cada vez menos trabajadores para vender la misma cantidad de producto, la que consiguen vender en el mercado. Porque al fin lo que determina el empleo son dos cosas: la cantidad de bienes que las empresas son capaces de vender en el mercado y el stock de capital que tienen, ¿no? Entonces, dada la cantidad de bienes que son capaces de vender al mercado, si incrementas la cantidad de capital que las empresas tienen, vas a necesitar de menos trabajadores, ¿no? O sea, vas a echarlos más gente a la calle, ¿no? Entonces, esta es la primera respuesta. La segunda respuesta, mira, aquí estamos hablando en términos de sueldos monetarios, no de sueldos reales. ¿Okay? La relación, cómo estamos aquí asumiendo una función de producción Cobb-Douglas con competencia perfecta, la relación entre sueldo real y empleo es inversa. Pero más importante, la distribución de renta es exógena, determinada por la tecnología, o sea, por los parámetros de la función de producción Cobb-Douglas. Entonces, claro que si incrementas, por ejemplo, a la participación de los sueldos en la renta, vas a incrementar el multiplicador de la inversión, porque el multiplicador es 1 dividido por 1 menos la propensión a consumo de los sueldos multiplicada por la participación de los sueldos en la renta. Entonces, si incrementas la participación de los sueldos en la renta, vas a incrementar el multiplicador y con eso vas a incrementar el nivel de actividad productiva de equilibrio de largo plazo. ¿No? ¿Ok? Pero no es esto que estamos discutiendo en la parte final del artículo. En la parte final del artículo, el sueldo real es el mismo. No cambia. ¿Vale? Lo que está cambiando son los precios nominales y los sueldos nominales. Y lo que el modelo quiere responder es si una reducción de los sueldos monetarios puede crear o puede incrementar la demanda agregada. Porque esto, mira, toda la economía mainstream, al fondo, está basada en la idea que la flexibilidad de precios y sueldos hace con que a largo plazo la economía funcione en una posición de equilibrio con pleno empleo. ¿No? Eso está en los artículos de Pigou, de Modigliani y de Patinkin. ¿No? Y bueno, lo que yo he argumentado es que desde el punto de vista práctico, para que una reducción de los sueldos monetarios pueda incrementar la demanda agregada, tiene que operar el efecto Pigou o efecto liquidez real. Pero lo que pasa es que el efecto liquidez real presupone pues una parte muy pequeña de la riqueza de las familias. La verdad, lo que sería el dinero que tienes en el bolsillo, el paper money. Que, bueno, con las nuevas tecnologías de hoy, cada vez se usa menos. En Brasil, mucho menos que en España. Vosotros aún pagáis más cosas en efectivo que nosotros. Nosotros prácticamente no utilizamos para operaciones legales, claro. Para corrupción sí que se continúa utilizando.
Creo que la gente joven menos que la gente mayor, pero sí. Es verdad que se usa.
¿No? Pero entonces, mira, es que si vas a dejar el efecto liquidez real funcionar, en los cálculos lo hizo Joseph Stiglitz a 30 años atrás, que para que la economía de Estados Unidos se recuperase de la Gran Depresión de 1929 por el efecto liquidez real, o sea, por una deflación de precios y salarios, llevaría 300 años. 300 años. O sea, como diría Keynes, a largo plazo estaremos todos muertos, ¿no? Pero mira, entonces lo que intenté en esta última parte del artículo es justamente evaluar si la deflación de sueldos nominales o monetarios tendría algún efecto positivo sobre la inversión y con eso sobre el empleo. El resultado fue que el efecto es mínimo y además, si ves en la simulación, pues incluso incrementa la volatilidad, ¿no?, de los sueldos en los periodos iniciales. O sea, generas más inestabilidad, ¿no? Es por eso que, por ejemplo, se han hecho durante la crisis de 2008, se ha hecho la quantitative easing, tanto en Estados Unidos como en Europa, ¿no? Y porque se quería evitar a todo costo una deflación de precios y sueldos que todos los dirigentes de Banco Central saben que te va a llevar al borde del desastre. O sea, que no va a funcionar.
Sí,
eso va a ser
incluso
la peor cosa que
aquí
puede pasar en una deflación de precios y sueldos.
sea, si aquí en España hay un paper de Cárdenas y la gente de Madrid que evaluó el impacto de la devaluación de precios sobre la balanza comercial y tal, y no mejoró en nada ni la inversión ni ninguna actividad económica, sino simplemente fue por importaciones que mejoró algo España.
Ujú.
Es decir, ya, sí, sí, sí es interesante. Gracias por la respuesta. Es que justamente lo he tratado de relacionar por lo otro, pero dándome cuenta sí, sí es verdad que es en términos nominales y no reales. Entonces, sí, sí. Sí.
Y en ese caso, y ya complementando un poco lo que estabais hablando ahora, tampoco no deja de ser curioso de que siempre que se está hablando de los efectos positivos de la deflación, en este caso se está centrando única y exclusivamente en el aspecto vinculado con el incremento de valor de los activos. Lo que no tiene en cuenta también es que el valor real de las deudas también está aumentando.
Sí,
Y que no tiene en cuenta el hecho de que buena parte del gasto, como sobre todo es el caso de la inversión, se financia en base al endeudamiento y el valor nominal de la deuda sigue permaneciendo constante. Eso no baja, los salarios sí, pero
sí.
normalmente conozco pocos casos en el cual una existencia de deflación, a los bancos o los acreedores acepten una quita del valor nominal de la deuda, lo cual eso también supone es negativo para el deudor.
Mira, fue lo que pasó en Estados Unidos en la Gran Depresión, porque los precios de los productos agrícolas se desplomó, los agricultores tenían deudas en los bancos que continuaron exactamente lo mismo y los bancos empezaron a tomar las haciendas, ¿no? Y eso fue el origen de las Hoover Bills, las favelas en Estados Unidos durante la depresión, porque los que tenían tierra la perdieron a los bancos y tenían que irse a las ciudades a ganar la vida de la forma posible, ¿no? Entonces, ya existió el experimento de deflación de precios y sueldos, y el efecto fue que se incrementó el paro, no que se disminuyó.
Ujú, ujú. Y ahí, si no he entendido, entonces, también en relación con lo que habíais comentado anteriormente, si no he entendido mal, por lo que te has comentado anteriormente, José Luis, respecto a la particular forma de la función de producción que has elegido, yo creo que entender entonces que lo que tú has querido demostrar es que, en realidad, utilizando la función Cobb-Douglas, lo que se demuestra es que va a existir paro involuntario.
Exactamente.
Claro, otra cosa es, quizás podríamos entrar en el debate de cuál es ese tamaño de ese paro involuntario. Y ahí yo creo que sí que es cuando en un momento dado podría tener, pues eso que comentaba también Daniel, que es a veces no se incluye otros aspectos que pueden estar relacionados con la situación de trabajo ocio o los aspectos institucionales, porque si no he entendido bien, el objetivo de tu análisis no es analizar las diferencias o la evolución de la tasa de paro, sino que es analizar precisamente cómo en un modelo como el modelo neoclásico, una función con Douglas, el resultado, entre comillas, normal es la existencia de paro. Otra cosa es que la tasa de paro pueda ser mayor, como por ejemplo ocurre en España, o puede ser más baja, como ocurre en Alemania. Ya ahí tendrías que entrar en otro tipo de factores que explican las
Sí, claro,
diferencias de la tasa de paro.
claro.
Pero claro, los resultados que observamos es que en los dos países, mucho o poco, hay paro involuntario. Eso es lo que creo que es lo que estás queriendo explicar, si no estoy equivocado.
Sí, la verdad es mostrar que el paro involuntario es el resultado normal de la operación de una economía capitalista. Punto. Nada más.
Ujú,
O sea, el tamaño del paro, claro, va a depender de factores institucionales, va a depender si es más adecuado representar la tecnología por una tecnología Douglas o por una tecnología Leontief, va a depender incluso del tamaño del gasto autónomo que no crea capacidad, ¿no? Porque hemos visto en el modelo que la ausencia de gasto autónomo que no crea capacidad incrementa el tamaño del paro involuntario, ¿no? Entonces, sí que se puede concluir, esto sí es importante, es que para que puedas llegar al pleno empleo en una economía capitalista, eso a largo plazo, tienes que tener algún tipo de gasto que no crea capacidad productiva. Y básicamente son dos, o tres, podemos poner tres, pero yo creo que son dos. Lo primero son las exportaciones. China. Mira, no es el caso de China, a mí me parece clarísimo, ¿no? China es el país que tiene la tasa de acumulación de capital más grande en el mundo, ¿no? 40% de su producto es destinado a acumulación de capital, ¿no? ¿Qué van a hacer con tanto capital? Si fuera solo para el mercado interno chino, no iban a conseguir emplear tanta gente. Mira cuántas fábricas existen en China. China debe tener hoy quizá un cuarto de la producción industrial del mundo. Pero su mercado interno no es suficiente para absorber toda esta producción. Bueno, esto incluso es una cosa que se expande un poco más del debate sobre la teoría general. Es algo que Cawdor, en los artículos en los años 60, decía sobre el desarrollo del capitalismo, ¿no? Que el capitalismo de la revolución industrial necesitó un mercado externo. Ha incrementado la renta en la agricultura, que fue esencial para producir un mercado externo para la industria, porque la industria no puede crear todo el mercado necesario para vender su producción, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que hay ese aspecto. Entonces, son las exportaciones. Bueno, el segundo, o es el consumo o es el gasto del gobierno. En fin. Y podemos pensar un poco ahora esta cosa de que los europeos quieren hacer, que es incrementar el presupuesto militar, pues exactamente de esta forma. O sea, vas a incrementar un gasto que no crea capacidad productiva, ¿no? Y con esto, la previsión del modelo es que vas a reducir el paro, ¿no? Entonces, creo que sería esto, Jesús.
¿Algún otro comentario, cuestión o pregunta? Bueno, pues si no hay ningún otro
No,
comentario.
Carlos Rodríguez está llamando
Ah,
la
Carlos,
mano.
sí, perdona,
Sí.
Carlos, que no te había visto la mano. Dime, Carlos.
Yo me tengo que retirar, que si no, no llego a comer. Gracias
Venga, Daniel.
Vale.
Ya.
Saludar ya de paso a José Luis y aunque he llegado tarde que tenga otra reunión. No, es como estoy pensando entre paro
Carlos, no
voluntario
se
y
te oye muy
involuntario.
bien.
Ahí va. ¿Se me oye? ¿Se me oye?
Ahora un poco.
No
No.
escucho.
A ver, ¿se me oye? ¿No?
Mal,
Mal.
Vaya.
mal, como muy de fondo.
Pues, ¿y ahora? Tampoco.
Un poco mejor.
Qué pena. No sé si me puede, no sé por qué ha estado funcionando perfectamente. ¿Ahora?
Un poco
Tampoco.
mejor.
Un poco mejor,
Bueno,
sí.
nada,
Dime.
es una pregunta muy, muy sencilla, saludarte y agradecerte el seminario. La distinción entre paro voluntario e involuntario, que conceptualmente parece que es obvia y evidente, sin embargo, luego ¿cómo se mira? ¿Hay estadísticas? ¿Alguien se ha atrevido a cuantificar qué parte del paro es voluntaria e involuntaria? ¿O era solo esa? Era por tratar de verificar igual empíricamente este concepto de voluntariedad e involuntariedad y no sé si existen datos sobre paro voluntario e involuntario, nada más. Y eso era todo.
Bueno, yo creo, eso es una pregunta, no sé cómo son hechas las estadísticas de paro en España, pero en Brasil, básicamente, un parado es una persona que ha procurado empleo en los últimos 30 días y no lo ha encontrado. O sea, se ha procurado empleo y no lo ha encontrado, entonces es un parado involuntario. Me parece que es sería la respuesta más sencilla. Pero existe un otro tipo de paro que no es el que Keynes está analizando, pero que fue definido por John Robinson en 1937, que el paro disfrazado. ¿Qué significa el paro disfrazado? Mira, piensa un trabajador que le echen fuera de una fábrica, donde ganaba, por ejemplo, 2.500 euros. Vamos a suponer que no hubiera en España el seguro paro, no hubiera la seguridad social para pagar a los parados durante el tiempo que están parados. Bueno, si no hay paro, si no hay la seguridad social, estas personas van a tener que hacer alguna cosa. Por ejemplo, pueden ir a, no sé, a trabajar en las tierras, como tenéis bastantes tierras en Castilla que están sin cultivar. Quizá la gente, no teniendo otra opción posible, iba a volver a las tierras, en las aldeas, para cultivar la tierra, para cuidar de vacas y no sé qué. Bueno, entonces en este caso no estarían oficialmente parados, porque estarían haciendo una actividad, pero una actividad de mucho menor productividad de la que tenía antes de ser echado fuera. Entonces, esto sería el caso del paro disfrazado, que es más común en países subdesarrollados, como es el caso de Brasil o demás países de América Latina. Cuando se echa fuera un trabajador de una fábrica, pues él tiene que hacer algo, porque el paro en Brasil solo son 6 meses de pagas y después ya se acabó, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué va a hacer? ¿Va a trabajar como por su cuenta o va a hacer un trabajo informal que puede incluso te ganar más un poquito, pero no tiene ninguno de los derechos laborales, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo, el desafío más grande me parece no es mensurar el paro involuntario, pero sí mensurar el paro disfrazado. Esto que me parece algo más complicado.
Muchas gracias. ¿Algún otro comentario, alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? Pues sin más, daros las gracias a todas las personas que habéis participado y asistido al seminario, especialmente, como no puede ser de otra forma,